we've reached the the seventh doorway now in your process of self-discovery, in your book Internal Power: 7 Doorways to Self-Discovery, and this one has unconditional love written on the door, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. And it's an interesting one to me, because so far we've been going through what seems to be a process, a sequential process, one of which leads to the next, each one of which leads to the next. And it's not yet obvious to me how it is that unconditional love is logically and naturally the next doorway. So I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about that. And also, of course, what is unconditional love? Because it's one of these things that we hear about, but actually we do need a clear explanation, really, of what it is, how we find it, and how we live it, and so on. So, would you take it away from there, please?
Sure. The process that we're speaking of, the self-discovery awakening, as it were, is, I would say, although sequential in the way that it kind of relates to our life and our own progress, and we can kind of look at it on a calendar kind of scale, or a linear type scale, or a sequential kind of scale, at least initially, that certainly is, more obvious than not. And it was very much the way mine kind of happened. As I've said, how I came to even write out these 7 doorways, and how it related to my own life, and how I'd been doing these various aspects. And yet, taking a little bit further step, and also stepping away at the same time, one could also see it as an unfolding process, less about the sequential, more about a building. And if we just look at what we've covered, in fashion so far with self-discovery, starting out with this choice, this awakening to the idea and understanding and realization that we can take our attention off the external material world, where our focus is so strong, and bring it more into our inner world, and begin to become aware of our thoughts and feelings. And then in that process, as we've discussed, move into understanding how we communicate with ourselves and how we communicate with others. In other words, these thoughts and feelings we're having, what are we saying to ourselves, about ourselves, in ourselves? And then also, what are we saying and how are we communicating, and what actions are we taking in the outer world? So now we have choice, and we realize that our thoughts and feelings have a certain amount of power in what we're experiencing. So then it becomes kind of almost logical and sequential, but also kind of builds upon this awareness that we are now understanding that, of course, it makes more sense if we actually become more positive in our approach to life, if we become more positive in our thinking, more expansive, more unlimited in our thinking, rather than constantly acting and reacting in limitation based on where we've been, prior to this self-discovery process unfolding. So in these next steps, or these next levels of awareness, then we recognize and acknowledge and accept the fact that we are in fact creative beings. So we have this creative nature. Whether we're aware of it or not, we're still creating. And this whole self-discovery is becoming aware of the fact that we are creating, and we can do it more consciously, we can do it more positively, we can actually use our thoughts and feelings to create more of the type of world we choose to experience than perhaps the one we've been experiencing. Which leads us into a deeper, another building cycle, another awareness cycle of the whole masculine and feminine energy, our imagination coupled with our willpower in summary fashion. We're using imagination and willpower. Well, in order to kind of make that next level of understanding to who we are, which is really self-discovery, we're discovering more about ourselves, then we move into this understanding of the child within, which seems a bit of a tangent at first, or perhaps a bit of a detour from our expansion and self-discovery, and yet a very vital and necessary component, because at some point we have to address who we've been up to this point. We have to address how we accumulated all these limiting thoughts and beliefs and suggestions and traditions. And we have to acknowledge and in a way heal, restore, balance, embrace, accept that we did and do have all this old understanding that may be outmoded and no longer serving us in the ways that it had. Because, for example, if we're no longer wanting to come from fear, fear no longer has the control over us. If we begin to accept and embrace ourselves, we trust ourselves, then doubt isn't going to be a recurring factor. And a lot of these doubts and fears, guilt and worries and shames, these things come from our childhood. So it's extraordinarily important to acknowledge and heal, accept, embrace, however we need to best come at it, and accept the fact that in this present moment, we have a lot of old energy that may still be stuck with us. And if we have old energy stuck with us, if we still carry shame from our childhood, for example, and we have shame from that childhood right now, then we're going to express shame, which is not necessarily the most positive and empowering, unlimited way of looking at life. So if we can heal the shame, if we can forgive the shame, if we can work, for a time period with that energy, we can free ourselves and allow everything to be the beautiful, magical, important, necessary steps that got us here. So in self-discovery, we kind of healing the past, we're becoming more present, we're more unlimited, we're more positive. Where would we go next? For me, it was very clear, very obvious, as I mentioned, I think even in the first conversation, that when I initially wrote out these 7 doorways, the first one on my list was unconditional love. The last one was choice. It was only a couple of weeks later that I realized, for me, the process, if you were to label it as such, was really starting with choice, leading to unconditional love. But I had concluded unconditional love very quickly as being a vital part of the self-discovery, because it's the piece that kind of pulls everything else together. Because if we are going within, if we are accepting ourselves, we are embracing ourselves, we are discovering our potential, we are beginning to manifest and use our thoughts and feelings to create a different world for ourselves, then the energy that pulls this all together is the love, the universal energy that is within us, that we have, various degrees of examples of love in our life. Well, to fully understand love really requires us taking this as a natural aspect of our discovery process and really diving into it and saying, what does love truly mean? And of course, this is where, I had come to my own conclusions that most of what was going on, and still to this day, I would say, that the understanding of love is very limited and very conditioned and very almost superficial in many ways. So for me to develop kind of a different, almost somewhat radical, universal definition for unconditional love was my way of saying, how can we look at this in broader terms? How can we use this again? My whole goal has been to, how can I make it practical? If I can't use it in my own life, then it doesn't seem to serve a purpose for me. And if I can make it more practical and I can actually see how it works in my life, then of course it's my great joy to share that, because others have shared aspects prior that helped me get to this point. Unconditional love was really a recognition of looking at all the various aspects that were and are used in our kind of cultural, societal conditioning. And love being everything from the experiences that we've had, where we felt a moment of emotional love, connection with someone or something, and sometimes even through grief and sadness, we experience kind of a deeper, compassionate love. There are certainly times where we felt the what we would say perhaps initially the unconditional love of our parents, even of some of our pets. We have experiences, but they're generally speaking very sporadic, very incremental, and not necessarily something that we've really honed or expanded in our life to have a real connection with. So they're kind of, events, experiences, circumstances that we acknowledge at the time, but they seem fleeting, that they don't seem to be long lasting. So I wanted to understand, how can I bring love as more of a conscious expression and experience in my life all the time? Well, obviously the physiological components, there's the love is understood as kind of a sexual interaction, or, we have, again, heightened emotions and connections, physical, tangible things that we can, kind of loosely label as love. And for a lot of people, that is the extent of it. And then, perhaps the one of the most sad things in a way is when we've taken love to such a descriptive level that we simply just banter around in our daily vocabulary. You know, I love my career, I love my spouse, I love my pet, you know, whatever we're doing, and we just say, I love this, I love that. And it simply comes up hollow. There's no real genuine connective meaning to love. You know, it's just going to become as relegated as a descriptive term. So with that said, kind of looking at how we've been conditioned, how we've looked at life with love as a concept, and kind of a vague concept in our reality, I kind of understood, like, well, what happens when you add this unconditional word to it? Because we certainly hear that. You know, when I started doing this, it wasn't nearly as common as it is today. I mean, generally speaking, everybody just spoke of love, but you know, the words unconditional were really relegated to something really extraordinarily outside of ourselves. You know, very, very rare glimpse of divine or something that was so intangible, so unreachable that, you know, we weren't even supposed to discuss it, much less, you know, even contemplate it, or heaven forbid, we'd actually bring it into our lives and start to, you know, build it as an expression. So taking all of this information and looking at what love is and isn't, and certainly the positive aspects where we do feel that connection, we can say that love in our life, you know, of course it has an emotional component, has a physiological component, has even somewhat of a mental component, and it has this descriptive aspect. But rather than singling it out as any one, it's really all of these and so much more. So love is more than just the word would even describe. It really is a way of being. When we're in love, we're very connected to something that is deeper, universal, intrinsic, and seemingly quite natural. When we're out of love, you know, that's when we see the contrast. We tend to think that, you know, many people still equate fear as the opposite of love, when in fact love is not part of fear at all. Fear is just really the absence of love. And when we're not focused on love, of course, fear and doubt are the natural things that we express, because we're not connected to the love that is universal and natural and already within us. Bring in this idea of unconditional. Unconditional is to be without condition, to be without limit, to be unlimited. So it made really great sense to me to marry those two words together and simply recognize that unconditional love is an unlimited way of being. Mm-hmm. In other words, if we can be present in the moment, which is a theme we've talked about in all of our conversations so far, this is the moment where we are physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually connected. So this is the point of which we can make choice. This is the point where we can say, forgive the past, you know, not be concerned about the future. This is where we're actually living, where we are supposed to be living, because this is where we are fully conscious and present and aware. Unfortunately, for many of us, and I certainly, you know, was as much a part of this, I lived a lot in my past, and I also, in living in that past in my mind and my head and my memories and the things that happened yesterday, the good, the bad, and the otherwise, I also then had kind of an aversion to the future because I was living in the past. Very rarely did I live in the present. Very rarely was I fully, completely whole in the here and the now. Mm-hmm. Well, with unconditional love, recognizing this present moment, recognizing we're unlimited beings, recognizing where our thoughts and feelings create, recognizing that we can create right here and now by choices, then we can also bring love as the foundational component. Because in fact, when we do connect with ourselves, when we do accept ourselves, when we do embrace ourselves, we almost instantaneously begin to embrace and reach out and have compassion for everyone else. Because in fact, what we have within, we give out. What we give out, we get back. It's a circle of life. If we have anger, we're going to put anger out. Chances are very strong that we will get anger back, anger reaction of some type, something that leads to that same energy. Well, isn't it kind of curious that most of humanity on the planet seeks love externally? We're looking for love to validate us. We're looking for people to validate us. We're looking for our pets, you know, our nature, for our careers. We're looking for all these material manifestations. I mean, simply turn on a radio, listen to any song, and there's something about wanting love. And yet, the simplest recognition is that it's already within us. It's always there. It's always present. we've been looking for love in the wrong places. I think that's even a title of a song. We are looking externally for something that already exists internally. And in fact, when we start to recognize and embrace the love that is right here, who we are, we begin to share it. As we share more love, we get more love back. And now we're in the right frame of looking at life. Now we're in an unlimited place. Because now there's no limit to how much love we can share. There's no limit how much we can bring love into our relationships, into our careers, into our communities, into nature, into the environment. There's really no limit, because the expression of love is universal and unlimited. So for me, it was extraordinarily practical. This was something that I could really anchor into and understand and really discover. And I will say, 20 years later, a couple of decades plus later, I'm still enjoying the process of finding out how much more love I have to give, how much bigger my heart can grow, how much more universal I can be. And oftentimes it's in the contrast. When I find myself having a momentary reaction to something local to me, something internal to me, or something global, it's like I recognize very quickly, okay, there's a reaction, that's interesting, that's not necessarily the most empowered position. How can I love this? How can I have more compassion? How can I have more forgiveness? How can I have more joy? How can I share more of myself from my heart? So the discovery process is the unconditional love. There is no destination or goal. So the seventh doorway isn't the pinnacle of what we've come to discover. It's really just the beginning.
And the beginning was there all the time, I guess. I mean, from what you've said, your instinct was to start with unconditional love when you were writing the book, and you've talked about love being intrinsic and a way of life. And we've been talking about the inner child and how it started with its pure potential. Would you go as far as to say that unconditional love is something that is really there, innate, intrinsic in us? It's there from the start. Well, most of us spend our lives trying to get back to that point.
Yes, and in fact, the way I actually came to, even though I started out with unconditional love in my initial list, and then I reversed it and made it, for this particular self-discovery process, I made it the seventh doorway rather than the first. And I made choice first. It made more sense to me. What I found in my own personal process, unconditional love was not the first thing that I was, say, consciously aware of. I may have, in order, become aware of positive thinking through a book or through a headline or through something. And then I might have become aware of the child within, and then, somewhere in that I developed the understanding that, wow, I actually have more choice. So it was much more multidimensional, and it did build on itself. My choosing to write it this way, for example, was to give people that have just either started on a self-discovery or choose or would like to start a way to begin the process in an expansive understanding. But interestingly enough, when I did come to writing the understandings that I had of unconditional love, came up with this definition, as a way to make it practical and real. It required, of course, all the other stuff. If you just jump in and say unconditional love is an unlimited way of being without kind of understanding the present moment, without recognizing our thoughts and feelings, it doesn't make as much sense. So I don't think I could have actually written about unconditional love and given that definition in the very beginning, because it had no context. It has no frame of reference. And the reason that is because we don't have context or frame of reference to love. So by taking our attention from the external, where most people have been, drawing it to the internal, we're actually also, as I've mentioned in another conversation that was shared with us, that we've also kind of been moving from the head down to the heart or into the heart. Spatially, it doesn't matter if it's up or below. The realization is we've been expanding our inner gifts, our inner awakening, our inner awareness. In this process, recognizing unconditional love really has always been there. It's just been so layered upon with beliefs and traditions and rituals and limitations and suggestions and teachings and generations upon generations of non-recognition of love. Well, of course, it's going to be so, in a way, hidden in plain sight that we will be so outwardly focused we forget that it's right there within us. When I came to writing Unconditional Love, one of the things that I found really fascinating, I think because it had been an evolutionary process, sequential, building, linear, and evolutionary, is that when I got to the point of actually expanding my understanding of unconditional love to where I could really put tangible words and consciousness to it, then I just rather spontaneously looked at it, well, if unconditional love is already there, okay, so we've kind of established that was the beginning point as you've asked, but now as I take it through the self-discovery process and I bring unconditional love back through the child, and of course that's what we actually use to heal a lot of that childhood energy. And then we go back into the masculine feminine, and we're actually embracing our imagination and our willpower. Now we're going back in and we're taking love into our creativity. Well, that just takes creativity in a whole new direction, because now we're infusing love. We're bringing our joy into whatever we're creating. And then we go back into positive thinking. Well, of course, positive thinking is about unconditional love. Well, now, of course, I'm beginning to communicate more positively, and I'm beginning to have more loving thoughts for myself, more accepting thoughts, more forgiving thoughts, more compassionate thoughts, and I'm expressing those. Then it brings me right back to choice. It's like, well, I have a choice. I can either love unconditionally or not. So this wonderful process came full circle. Mm-hmm. And I, in fact, did end up at the beginning where I started with unconditional love. Mm-hmm. And for me, the essence of all of that self-discovery is to recognize that the unconditional love is in us, and it is always there, and it is something we can always express. And it doesn't matter if we have any kind of action or reaction to anything. Everything is worthy of forgiveness. Everything is worthy of compassion. We are worthy of forgiveness. We are worthy of compassion. And it's coming from within. So if we want to understand love, then right here, right now is where we begin the process. This is where we begin the whole understanding of love, and it constantly grows. It constantly expands. There's always more levels of potential we find. There's always more opportunity to connect with who we are, and how we relate to the world will provide even more opportunity and more opportunity. And it just is, it becomes now the natural choice. And this has certainly been my choice, is recognition of, I'm going to choose to make unconditional love as my life journey. Don't have any judgments about it, don't have any opinions, don't have any expectations. I'm just going to see what love means for me. And the exploration over the last couple of decades has certainly been so expansive and so amazing. And yet I can also say that the few short years of self-discovery that led me to bring this material together in a book form was as equally as expansive and amazing. So prior to knowing any of this, I was discovering, before I wrote about discovery, I was already discovering myself. Then I wrote about it, and I'm still discovering myself. So for me, the joy is in the discovery, because I keep finding out more and more potential, more and more opportunity, more and more joy, more and more happiness, and it keeps growing in expansive, building ways. So is there an end? For me, I just enjoy the whole journey of unconditional love.
Or would you say that unconditional love is really the fundamental thing about our lives? That we're born as a loving being, and really our lives ideally would be an expression of that, a manifestation of that we would be love in our lives. I mean, how fundamental would you say it is in that respect?
If we take the idea of the beliefs and traditions and rituals, if we don't focus on love, and culturally speaking, over the last couple of thousand years, there's been very strong energies in cultural and societal belief systems, religious belief systems, government constructs. And there's been a tendency towards sameness, universal, everybody has what they consider the truth. And oddly enough, from that single truth that everybody thinks they have, they've fractured off and created more governments, more religions, and more strife amongst each other, because people have failed to recognize this unifying principle. Mm-hmm. Now, I had an awareness of this when I wrote about it. When I brought it to pen to paper, I was already aware and understanding unconditional love for myself. I can also say that in the last couple of decades, I've been extraordinarily fortunate to expand my heart and my connection to all of humanity. That was there as a seed idea when I started the self-discovery process, but it has germinated and flowered enormously, even in the past decade, with the nonprofit that I'm involved with, the Love Foundation, reaching people, literally in every corner of the world and connecting heart to heart, I have come to understand that, and it's kind of exemplified in one of the experiences we've been fortunate in the past half century, is when we started to go off planet and we started to beam back pictures of our beautiful Earth. From that perspective, we see no walls, we see no nations, we see no governments, we see just the beautiful blue orb, and we know intrinsically we are part of that whole. Prior to that, I think the only connection we had as being on Earth, and we'd look up in the sky at the nighttime and say somehow we would know we were intrinsically connected to the stars, the trillions of stars that gazed back at us. So we've always had this connection knowing. The challenge is when we are so externally focused, we tend to see everything in separation. We tend to see ourselves in relationship to our world, and where we don't connect, if we don't have love, we don't connect. When we don't connect, we tend to then be in opposition. We tend to push away. We tend to be afraid. We tend to doubt. We tend to then create an anger and hatred, and this snowballing consciousness that is externally focused places us in a position where there's almost no opportunity in a way to find love. And that's naturally so, because we're externally focused. We're looking for love in the wrong places. When we draw our attention inward and we begin to recognize that the love is already within us, and we begin to accept ourselves, we begin to transcend, transmute, forgive, heal, release all these separative ideas. In other words, when we stop being our own inner critic, when we start embracing who we are, we start embracing our personal power, we start embracing our potential, we begin to see the personal power and potential in everyone around us. We begin to cultivate it in ourselves. We naturally begin to cultivate it in others. Prior to this, when I was very externally oriented in banking and finance and business, I cultivated people, but only to the degree I could cultivate myself. And in most cases, that was not very good. I was not a big fan of myself because I just was doing everything right, but I was ignoring what it took to be happy. And happiness and joy, those are intrinsic in our natural states. And in fact, when we do step back and we look at the bigger picture, when we go so expansive that we see the earth and we see that there are no walls and no boundaries, then we start to connect heart to heart. Now we start to see that everyone smiles, everyone cries. We get back to our human connection, this universal love that literally creates order out of chaos. When we look at the stars, we feel love. When we see the sun, we feel the warmth, the love of the sun. When we go out into nature, we feel nature resounding love and cocooning us in love. Oddly enough, the only place we tend to not feel love is in ourselves and amongst each other. So the whole self-discovery process is really an awakening to reconnect ourselves to the love that is already there. Love's already in nature. Love's already in everything that runs our body, because certainly without the love that connects and causes the wisdom that makes our body function, we wouldn't even have thoughts and feelings. We would have no connection to anything. So we can already begin to embrace and accept our bodies for all the beautiful service it provides. We can look at all the teachers and all the examples and all the educators and all the governments and all of the institutions and say, wow, in this grand separation, I have found a connection. And because of the separation, I've actually found a connection. In other words, because of the contrast, I'm now realizing that, wow, I embrace love so much more. So in fact, now unconditional love allows me to have extraordinarily broader, more expansive relationships. And I see now relationships are no longer with a family member or a significant other or a close friend. I find unconditional love, the relationship, in every place I go and everyone I meet. I'm having a momentary relationship because I'm now connected to them. I'm now recognizing that their smile is my smile, their gaze is my gaze, their fear is my fear. The difference is I'm becoming more consciously aware of it. They may or may not, and because I'm more consciously aware of it, I can encourage them with greater love than react to their action with my own reaction. So it is fundamental, it is intrinsic, but who knew? I certainly wasn't educated or taught any of these things. I had to go explore it for myself. There were certainly great tools and resources when I started to explore. I found answers to some of my questions, but it really was just the reflections that I was already beginning to experience in myself. But let's face it, if our parents and their parents' parents' parents didn't have it, they didn't, consciously look to love it's going to be very difficult for any of the people around us that we so necessarily reach out to in our formidable growing years, those early years. You know, their love is going to be limited. So we're going to take on that limitation. Even though we came into this world with unlimited potential, we begin to take on limitation. We can continue that through to the death cycle if we wish. In fact, a lot of people have a very strong issue with life and death, and more particularly, they focus on being afraid to die, and I would actually question that and say that perhaps they're afraid to live. I think more people are actually afraid of their personal power, to recognize that they have incredible power, and that in fact, with that power comes tremendous responsibility, and with that comes enormous opportunity. So are we actually afraid of dying, or are we actually afraid of living? And I would say in many of my experiences connecting with people, they're actually more afraid of truly living, because then they have to give up the game. They kind of have to give up all their limiting beliefs. They have to kind of think for themselves. They have to be for themselves. And for many people, that is a scary concept. And in a way, having these conversations and sharing these, you know, through various ways is to say and share to people that it is okay, that we can actually embrace our personal potential. And in fact, we won't find a fearful, destructive potential. We will actually find a very loving potential. And that exploration will lead us to more loving experiences. You know, it's really in the fear that we destroy. It's really in the doubt that we destroy. It's when we don't see beyond the boundaries, when we don't see beyond the nations, when we don't see beyond our own limitations, that's when we tend to react and fight back. When we connect, all that goes away, because now we're connecting to the intrinsic part of ourselves, and that natural intrinsic part of ourselves is love, from my perspective.
You've reminded me of the saying that love will always find the way, and you've mentioned about how over the last couple of thousand years we've had so much division in one way or another, and yet in recent times we've had pictures of the planet from space, and of course now we've got the internet, and in all sorts of ways we're really being challenged to find a way to love everyone, aren't we? And it's almost as if it's the love is finding the way by coming full circle and giving us opportunities and challenges to make sense of the world that we live in. Certainly from an external point of view, but we have to find that in ourselves first, recognize that it is there within us, before we can then solve the final piece of the conundrum or the puzzle, and start expressing it in the world. But that's the kind of process that it seems as if we're going through at the moment, and what the kind of things that you're explaining are how we can find that unconditional love, and what we have to do in order to clear the way for it. I mean, is that would you say that is something like the kind of process that we're going through at the moment, with an expanded awareness of who we are?
I could say that we are doing that now, and in fact we are always doing it. The expansion process, even over the last couple of years, or a couple of thousand years, for example, the self-discovery process, we've gone through a lot of dark and destructive time periods through that. And yet, through each of even those experiences, we have found collectively, on a global scale, our ways out of it. In other words, because we've allowed a certain amount of expansion of judgment and critical nature and unforgiveness, and really looked so externally that we then created such strife and such difficulty, you know, on local levels all the way up to planetary levels with global conflicts, that discovery is always going on. In fact, you know, 3,000 years there was a different level of discovery going on, and 4,000 years a different level. 50 years ago, different level of discovery. What we're finding is that we are, as a culture, a race upon this planet, we have really kind of begun to recognize more universally in all of our hearts an awakening and understanding that there is a natural connection. That even in the past 100 years, for example, our interconnectedness through inventions and through opportunities has allowed us to interact with people of distant lands in ways that we would have never interacted with in any particular lifetime. You know, only a very few journeyed beyond their own confines, and out of those few, very few returned to report back. Now, all of a sudden, we're seeing in this past century alone kind of a global expansion of interaction. And of course, because we're bringing our fears and our doubts into a lot of these things, we're creating strife, you know, as we go. And yet, through each level of strife, we've also come kind of to the other side and said, okay, wow, that's not quite working. And we're saying, okay, let's go in and discover a bit more. And even in this past decade, for example, you know, when I wrote this 2 decades ago, life was extraordinarily different than it has been in the past decade. And even in the past couple of years, it's taken even a more quantum exponential leap. And our interconnectedness on a more personal level through social interaction has just, you know, expanded in ways that are almost confounding to our mind, because now we're beginning to interact with people and see faces and see pictures and be able to have verbal, visual communication anywhere on the planet without limitation, essentially. So our ability to connect and reconnect, is probably a better way of saying, has just become an amazing, extraordinary opportunity. So discovery on a very individual level, as we've been discussing in these conversations, as we've been discovering more of ourselves, we've also been putting out the thoughts, feelings, and desires that we want to be more connected. So lo and behold, the universe, the manifestations and material components start to reflect that. And because we are no longer just wanting to manifest a single item for ourselves, we're wanting greater peace, greater harmony, greater joy on the planet. The whole collective is discovering ways of how to provide that. You know, one of the things that we're finding is that, for example, through technology, which, you know, we've kind of moved beyond the industrial, moving into the technology, into the information age, that technology is expanding to go along with our own inner discovery. Technology is discovering ways to, say, create an open internet connection, you know, an opportunity for people to connect. And a lot of people are doing a tremendous amount of things where they're actually coming from their heart, and they're going beyond themselves and saying, I'm not just trying to create this for myself because I want my material reflections. I want, you know, love to express itself through my home, my cars, my relationships. But people are literally coming from a place where they recognize they're connected to their community, they recognize they're connected to their nation, they recognize they're connected to the whole planet. And they're implementing their energies, they're using their creative force for a greater good. So now we've kind of gone from this external material orientation to an internal recognition of our personal potential. And now we're taking this personal potential and we're no longer just creating more materialism for ourselves, but we're in fact saying, how can I make this entire experience better for all? Well, doesn't that really sound like love?
Absolutely.
Unconditional love? Isn't that really what we're saying, is that we're beginning to look at life with compassionate eyes, compassionate love? Well, did it just start, you know, in the past decade? No, this has been an ongoing thing. It's just we're in a extraordinarily potent time where, because we're taking and making an effort to go within and actually heal and bring wholeness to ourselves, we are simultaneously setting the stage to bring greater wholeness for everybody on the planet, including the planet herself. So again, where we talk about it sequentially, we talk about it in a linear fashion, we talk about it over centuries, it is in fact much more multidimensional, much more of a building process, much more of an unfolding process. I mean, the beauty for me is that the whole self-discovery journey, and implementing and using, you know, simple words like unconditional love, you know, simplifying my vocabulary has changed dramatically. What I would talk about before or talk about now, you know, the focus is so incredibly different that the very choice of words are more expansive and more unlimited. So it affects every part of my communication, internally and externally. It affects every part of my expression, the actions I take, the kindness I share. And it really is because I'm coming from deeper and deeper love and a deeper recognition of this universal connectedness. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it has to be there. Otherwise, we couldn't connect with it. I mean, fear, really, if we really think about fear, for example, it's a very fleeting experience. Mm-hmm. It's usually related to very circumstantial events, if they're external, and it's usually conjuring up of a previous experience that we may have had, or, interestingly enough, as we discover in our own search and our own understanding, that many of the fears that we seem to carry were brought to us by other people, other people's fears that we then picked up as suggestions because they had an event where they weren't fully empowered, so they had a fearful reaction, and then they're carrying that energy. They get around us, we pick up on their story, we pick up on their energy, and all of a sudden we have their fear, when in fact it was never our experience. But because they've had it and they've told somebody else about it, and that person had something similar, and then, you know, it goes on, it becomes exponential. Well, the same dynamic happens when we expand our love. The difference is fear simply disappears where love never does. Love is always there. Fear only reveals itself in moments where we have serious self-doubt. In fact, it's a separation from love. When really understood, when we're connected to love, there is no fear, there is no doubt. When we disconnect from love for whatever reason, there's instantly doubt, because now we no longer feel that connection to love. So doubt, and doubt, from my understanding and my perspective, is really the precursor, is what is the foundation in fear. Because the more doubt we have, the greater our fear, and the more we react from that non-love. And yet, in this present moment, all we need to do is take a deep breath and we reconnect to the love. So it's very practical. It's something everyone and anyone can do. And that's been my great joy, to share that this is already the unlimited potential in me is the unlimited potential in you, the unlimited potential in absolutely every person on this planet, regardless of race, creed, color, financial condition, status in life. It absolutely doesn't matter. The universal potential is universal. And that, to me, is probably one of the greatest things that I enjoy sharing, is reminding people that they're unlimited. By recognizing that they're unlimited, then they can go off and explore their potential. But because they are now reminded, they can reconnect to the love that's already within them, and then that love will guide them into all of their hopes and dreams. But it will be the love that guides them. We've been being guided by fear and doubt because we've been separated from love. You know, we can accelerate this process in a very great way as a personal self-discovery and as a planetary discovery if we reconnect the love.
So in recognizing that unconditional love really is there within us already, to be brought out into our own lives, you are still talking about things that we need to do in order to clear the way, as I was saying, through such things as forgiveness and not being judgmental with others, and I think in your book there were a few of, I think you said recognizing the effects of forgiveness, fear, judgment, guilt and worry, as you've just been saying, relationships, detachment, and even life and death will quickly help us to overcome often debilitating thought processes and move us towards unconditional love. So there's a fair amount that we need to keep in mind, isn't there, as we
well, and we will connect with these things naturally on our path. The difference that we now have is we can choose to embrace each moment, each thought, each feeling with unconditional love. And that's where we come through these 7 doorways, is recognizing that we actually have the ability to choose unconditional love as our response, as our integration of these things, so that when we are looking at forgiveness, we're recognizing, well, now I understand why forgiveness works. You know, before this, I didn't have any recognition for forgiveness. I was told I was supposed to forgive, but nobody explained to me why it was necessary, how it worked, and what were not necessarily the benefits and rewards, but the practical nature of forgiveness is really a letting go. It's a letting go of the outmoded, outdated, limited ways of looking at life, limited experiences. If something happened to us 30 years prior and we're still in judgment of it, we're still reacting to it, we're still critical of it, we're still blaming someone, we're keeping blame, judgment, criticism alive right now, which means what we have within is what we give out is what we get back. That means we're going to continue to blame, continue to judge, continue to criticize, we're going to continue to have experiences of blame, judge, criticism. The value of forgiveness is that's what happened then. We did the best we knew how. They, whoever, it, whatever, did the best it knew how. And if we actually connect to love, then the most natural response is to have compassion and say, wow, somehow that helped me. Even if I don't fully understand it at the moment, I can say, I can forgive that because it helped me get here. It helped me find strength that, even if it took 30 years before we start to wake up and say, I'm going to discover myself, those things were necessary because they were reflections of how we were creating in limitation. And as we begin to create an unlimited, we don't really know quite where we're going to go because we've been so conditioned to create with limiting thoughts, limiting beliefs, limiting ways of looking at life. This whole exploration and expansion, as individuals and as a race, we don't really know quite honestly what our potential is. We've experienced the destructive side. We're still kind of experiencing levels of that destructive side. But how can we as individuals and as communities and as races on an entire planet begin to create universally holy and for the greater good of all? That's new territory. We're going to get it all right in the first step? Probably not. Did I get it all right in the first thought? Absolutely not. Pieces like forgiveness, that's going to be a great, one could almost call it a tool, a recognition, a piece that we use to help clear up some of that energy when we go and face life through a level of forgiveness for self. All the mistakes we think we've made, we accept these things, we move on. We bring more presence into the present. We bring then the opportunity to bring love in, where just a moment before we had judgment, we had fear, we had doubt, we had guilt, we had worry, we had shame. Bring ourselves back into the present, reconnect to the love. Now we can look back on our past and have great joy. I look back on my past. I didn't initially because I had to go through a lot of this. I had to take time to say, oh, okay, I got to forgive that. I got to release that. I need to detach from that. In other words, the material things in my life, we are custodians of material things. We don't own anything. We don't own our houses or our cars. We don't own anything on this planet. We don't own a strip of land. In the bigger scheme of things, in the big picture, we are custodians. We are here interacting with nature, and we're interacting with each other. Now, that's a very big picture. That's probably a huge, huge leap for most people because we're conditioned to owning property and owning things and owning people and owning, all these things. We need to have, we need to own our, even down to our relationships. We think somehow we need to own the other by controlling them or by making them behave the way we want them to behave. The self-discovery, some of the things that I'm talking about, may sound so universal and so expansive as to be untouchable and unreachable. In fact, I was in a lot of those places early on because I did go through forgiveness and I did keep reminding myself of detachment because I did keep letting go of guilt and worry. I kept letting go of, shameful thoughts that had, been picked up on or that I shared or, even things like, a lot of people like to be sarcastic, for example. Mm-hmm. Well, sarcastic isn't usually funny because there's a lot of shame in it. There's an energy, just as we've talked about the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion in a previous conversation. There's also something, sarcasm is usually a way to gain attention, but it's a very negative attention. And usually the people that are sarcastic are not very in love with themselves, to say. They're not very accepting of themselves. And so they tend to lash out in somewhat of a quasi-funny way. But in fact, sarcasm has a very fine line that it crosses over very quickly where it becomes very hateful, very mean, very spiteful. So, when we get aware of our own way of doing that, we begin to hear our own sarcasm. So, well, that wasn't the most loving way. Well, wow, how loving am I? I've gone through a lot of these. I continue. But those big pieces are not as big for me anymore. So when I talk about looking at the global planet and even off planet, looking at the Earth in relationship to our own galaxy and thinking, well, God, there's billions of galaxies. Wow, that, it makes the mind boggle. We kind of have a very difficult time relating to the immediate, concerns in front of us in our living space. What are we thinking about billions of galaxies? So there's a way to incorporate this awareness in a practical way by looking at forgiveness, by looking at detachment, by recognizing, okay, I worry too much. I love myself enough to not worry so much. I can let it go. I can trust myself. Well, that's a big one. If I'm not worried about how I'm going to die, if I'm not concerned about that, I can actually start to live. Well, I can start to trust myself. I can actually start to trust my choices. I can actually start to pay attention to who I am, where I'm at. I can let go of the fear. I can let go of the doubt. I can let go of the judgment. Why do I really need to judge what other people or other things are in contrast to what? Do we really need to be our own lawbreaker, lawmaker, judge, and jury? Do we really need to set up such critical components in our life that anything that doesn't match our considered ideal view of the world, that everything else must be wrong? It simply doesn't work that way. In fact, a lot of what we react to is because we recognize in an intrinsic, innate way that we are all collectively living with a lot of limitation that just doesn't work anymore. You know, you don't put 7 billion people on a planet and get us all to work together if there's constantly a us against them, or higher or lower, or my belief, your truth, my truth, and everything is in opposition, when in fact it's the love that's the unifying force. Nature doesn't fight with itself. Nature doesn't create pollution. Isn't that an interesting thing? A volcanic ash is not pollution. It's only when we take something and create it and recreate it and make something out of it in our image that we create effluvia and excess that is pollution-oriented. Well, how many of our thoughts are polluting? How many of us walk around with polluted feelings? We're polluted with limitation, with suggestion, with really things that no longer work for our highest and greatest good. And it's the love that connects us to that highest and greatest good, because that love is already universal. That love already ensures that our planet, you know, our planet has been around for how long? And we're sitting here thinking we're going to destroy it, you know, in one fell swoop. I mean, the planet has endured far longer than any one of us will ever even begin to contemplate. So there's a wisdom going on. You know, we haven't gone racing, careening, crashing into the sun. There's a blueprint, there's a plan, there's a connection, and it's very wise and very loving and very benevolent. We are very wise, we are very loving, we are very benevolent when we choose to. And that's why I think, you know, we talk about all the stuff in between in the doorways, and they're just as important and as critical, and yet particularly pulled out, the beginning choice and the ending unconditional love where we've come to, they are totally interconnected with all these other components. But the fact is, you know, we are loving, benevolent, and wise if we choose to. If we choose to see ourselves that way, and if we choose to look at life that way, we are loving, benevolent, and wise. We are unconditional love and embodiment when we choose it. So it's no longer something that is left to the divine. It's no longer something that is left completely as an unattainable, unreachable concept that we can't even connect to. We are, in fact, love. Love is always there. In fact, we prove that every moment we just turn to love, and it's instantly there. Forgiveness is always, you know, the piece that kind of helps us reconnect to the love, because it's the forgiveness that heals whatever we consider as a separation or that is non-love. You know, all these things come together, and now all of a sudden we're actually enjoying life. We're actually looking forward to creating. We're looking forward to fresh new ideas tomorrow. You know, a lot of people are, you know, as afraid of that as anything. They are so conditioned by routine and habit. They want everything tomorrow to look like it did yesterday. And most people are not willing in many ways to recognize that, wow, every cell of my body dies off in less than a year. So in fact, my entire body, year to year, is filled with fresh new cells. So we are in fact dying and being born again constantly. We are dying to old ways and being rebirthed into new ways. Why wouldn't we want to look forward to the opportunity of new ways of looking at life? Why wouldn't we want to look forward to the opportunity of new creative potentials, new ways of embodying and embracing love? Well, the only reason why is because we're stuck in habit and routine. Oddly enough, fear and doubt are often the path of least resistance. In other words, it's easier to fall into fear and doubt than it is to take that little tiny extra step and reconnect with love. When we do reconnect with love, of course, it's permanent and sustaining. But it's easier to cave into yesterdays. It's easier to cave into fear and doubt. It's easier to ignore our personal power because, you know, we haven't always wanted to take responsibility. The funny thing is, we're creative either way. If we're completely ignorant and unaware of our creative capacity, that doesn't mean that we aren't consciously responsible for our creative capacity. It just means we're ignoring it, we're suppressing it, we're denying it, we're not acknowledging it. And of course, what happens is we create more of the old limitation. So you can see this thing kind of cycles and recycles and cycles and recycles. And yet the self-discovery process is kind of like, I hesitate to say the intervention, but it's an awakening is probably the best way. And it's certainly, like I said, the awakening started to happen in slow and subtle ways long before I started to actually consciously focus on it, work with it, and then even write about it. And yet the awakening continues to go on. The difference now is that I look forward to life each day, saying, I wonder what this day is going to bring. I wonder how I can bring more love into this. How can I create more of what I choose to create And in that, I might be very individual and seemingly very singular because a lot of other people around me are creating based on habit and ritual, safety, security, all these kind of false concepts that we believe in so strongly until they disappear. We really think that's, we're all secure and safe in these ways, but then when it disappears, we realize, wow, I wasn't so safe and secure. But what's funny is when that does happen, all of a sudden we find a level of ourselves that we didn't acknowledge. We awaken to the fact that we have far more potential. We find strength where we didn't know we had strength. We find courage in some of those experiences. My way of looking at this through a self-discovery process, why don't we take this on more consciously of our own free will? Why not discover more and make it a point to discover more who we are so that we can be a co-creative natural component to our own evolution, our own journey, our own experience, rather than still constantly acting and reacting to experiences and having to find, courage through fear. Why not find courage through choice? So to me, it's a different way of approaching life. It's not any better or worse, it's just a different way. It happens to work for me, and I think it is going on with everyone in one way or another, and to the degree that they choose to open up and recognize their personal love, recognize their personal power. There's no judgment as to how we get there, and I've certainly recognized that, I've been very fortunate to have woken up when I did. For me, it was a good time for me to do a lot of things, and because of that, I have very different, prior to this kind of awakening, my life is very, very extraordinarily different than the way it's been since I've become more conscious of my own discovery of self. And it's far richer, it's far grander, it's far more unknown, and for some that might be a tad scary, but it's really more interesting than it ever was before. When I was beating to the drum of what everybody else was doing, it wasn't very interesting. In fact, in hindsight, as I started to rapidly discover myself, I quickly looked back and I thought, wow, what a boring life I was living. But it does take a sense of, courage and strength and tenacity and perseverance and desire and love for self to actually embark and stay consciously focused on self-discovery. May not appeal to everyone. The idea is that it is going on, whether we're fully aware of it or not. And perhaps by being a little more aware of it and maybe taking some of these things that we've been talking about over all these series, judgment and fear, and, discussing them will bring understanding, and through understanding we connect to love in our own right more easily. And then we get to explore more of our potential. And that's really what the whole self-discovery process is about, exploring our potential through love.
So, exploring our potential for love and making a commitment to the process, and that's going to take us further on now, isn't it? We've come out of the room with unconditional love on the door, and we're back in the grand hallway. Okay, where do we go from here? Is that should we leave that till next time?
That will be our new beginnings.
Okay.
We've gone through the discovery process, and in a way, where do we go from here? What is it about? Now that we synthesize and bring all these pieces together, say we've gone through this discovery process, where next? And so, yes, let's make that our new beginnings, our next and final presentation.
All right, I look forward to that. Thank you, Harold.
Pleasure.